Cool. Good to see you all again. I did this myself, pretty artsy, huh? So feel for snow. We're not going to talk about what this looks like in regards to ski quality, because we know it looks pretty terrible. But I guess I'll introduce kind of how I got to this topic. And apologize indirectly to Don to having to sit through this again. But I was initially approached to put together this talk by Lynn Wolf and the organizing committee for the Jackson conference this last fall. And Lynn Wolf, the editor of the Avalanche Review, she gave me a call and she said, Terry, we'd really like to have you come and talk in Jackson this year. And I said, okay, well, fine. And what can I contribute? What do you think would be useful from my background compared to all the other folks that'll show up and give some talks? And she says, one thing really hung with me at the end of last year's conference, and I was sitting there with Jamie, one of the other organizers, and at the end, despite everything they heard, she was captured by this one comment in that Jamie said, I just really wish people would think about the consequences of their decisions. And she said, Terry, I wish with your background, maybe you can speak a little bit to that. And I thought about it, and certainly with some of the different roles that Scotty's mentioned that I've had over the years, I, like many of you, in this context, have been in the situation looking at a scene and thinking, God, what were they thinking? Right? And as you can imagine, my role with the Park Service, but also now as an emergency physician, no doubt, that crosses my mind many times. But as I've thought about my own personal decision making and trying to refine that to be safer, I've kind of come to discover in reading a lot about decision-making processes that maybe the question we need to be asking ourselves is not what they were thinking so much, but what were they feeling at that moment when they made that decision. And what I'd like to present and argue for you today is kind of a nice, I guess, a follow-up to what Don had introduced and reviewed for us so nicely before. But this is really the mechanics of the decision-making. Part of what you learned or heard about before was a review of kind of some of the context in which we make these decisions, but I think this is a little bit of a self-awareness project for all of us on actually how that decision happens and how we can catch ourselves in making these decisions. And so as a matter of introduction, I think I'll reference back to, a resource that many of us refer to, and Margaret, thanks for showing up, because you reviewed this for us a couple years ago, right? This is often what we refer to with high-stakes decision-making, and I won't go into deep detail here, but I think it's a nice construct and kind of a basis to start from, because I think this is how we're taught how to approach these low-frequency but high-consequence events and how to refine our decision-making, and it merits a little review. As you know, this is Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, that outlines kind of our models of decision-making, and the theory here is that our folly, our pathway into folly oftentimes is utilizing that intuitive, fast decision-making process, right? This is the emotional, perhaps based on our experience. It's a shortcut. It's efficient. We definitely need to use it sometimes. But perhaps in using that kind of efficiency, our clouded judgment, perhaps, and our memory, it often leads us to folly, where the solution, apparently, is that we need to adopt the slow process. So what does the slow process look like? Well, you guys have all been trained in this, right? Slow down. You just heard this from Don, right? Slow down, and the reason why you slow down is you look at the options available in front of you, right? You've got a number of different doors to choose from, and then to make sure we're seeing all the doors appropriately, we might even use something like a checklist, right? Okay, let's not even slow down. Let's make sure we're covering all our bases. We know all the information. Utilize that checklist. Then, once we have all those factors laid out for us, right, we weigh the risks and benefits, right, in those decisions, and then ultimately through this deliberative process, we identify the path that is most supported by, perhaps our best available evidence, and that's where we give the green light and we proceed. Sound familiar, I imagine, to most of you guys. But this is the one thing I really want to highlight. I think one of the unintended kind of misunderstandings of this dual process theory of fast and slow is that somehow for that reason to prevail, we need to keep our emotion totally out of it, right? We're taught to okay, don't think emotionally, don't be impulsive. You got to slow down, be analytical, use the checklist, and proceed. But what I'm going to outline here for you today, based on some previous research, and what I want to argue for you guys, is that feelings themselves are actually our predictions of what's going to happen with that choice, okay? We ski this is going to be a sweet powder run. We feel pretty stoked about that, right? Okay, the same thing can happen with danger, and certainly our prior experiences, and particularly our memories, will guide us in our decisions in the future. And I know many of you know that, leading into the decisions that you make today based on your prior experiences and perhaps some painful memories of bad mistakes. So even though you think you might be making a cool, calculated, deliberate choice, your feelings are very much at play in that. And remarkably, they can actually be evolving in the process of learning how to make a decision for the first time. So let's skip through here real quick, just to make it a little bit shorter. So in that, I would like to just kind of tell you a little bit of story about a common psychology experiment, the Iowa gambling test. I don't know if anybody's read a lot about decision making. Anybody heard of this before? A little bit. So this whole idea of emotions getting kind of engaged in a decision making process is probably best illustrated by this experiment. What happens is you have a subject, you put in a chair, it's essentially like a lie detector chair. They get this little monitor that goes on their skin, it's a galvanic skin response monitor. So it basically measures your sweat glands coming into play. When do your sweat glands come into play? When you're kind of getting nervous, right? Or you're getting stimulated. And then they're presented with a gambling task. So they're told at the beginning that they're given $100, and then they have to play this gambling game, whatever they win, they take home, okay? So there's some stakes. Little they know, of course, the experimenters have it rigged so everybody takes home $50 as part of the grant for the experiment, right? But they're told that they need to pick cards from one of 4 decks, and depending what they pick, they have to pick up to 100 cards out of these, 200 here. And some cards, like the high face cards, are big winners, and the low ones, the 2s and 3s, are big losers. And then a couple of cards right in the middle, say the 8s and 9s and 10s, are just kind of like steady wins, like low $5 at a time, something like that. And so they put them into the task. And they start randomly picking, right? Now, unbeknownst to the subjects, the first 2 decks, or at least 2 of the decks, let's say the green one and the red one here, they're loaded with big wins and big losses, okay? Whereas the other 2 decks are kind of just overall steady, nice wins. Small, nothing big, a couple bucks at a time, but definitely steady wins. And what they notice is as those big losses start to be experienced, the galvanic skin response starts to pick up pretty quickly, right? Nobody likes loss. Right? Loss aversion is a tremendously powerful motivator. And interestingly, they asked during the experiment for people to try to make predictions about what's happening. And their actions often are guided to the safer decks before they can actually explain why they're deciding to choose them. Okay, so they're actually able to say, they're actually having a hard time to actually articulate it before the action is already happening. The pattern is already being witnessed, that the frequency of picking from the safer decks is already happening before they can explain why. So that's kind of interesting. So that introduced this concept like, well, maybe there's some sort of somatic marker. We're kind of going by the spidey sense, this tickling, this feeling in our skin, this racing of our heart that's guiding us away from potentially one option to another. Okay, maybe convincing, but maybe not so convincing. And then a really interesting opportunity arose when a neuroscientist from USC, this guy Antonio Damasio, does anybody happen to read this book? Not many have read it. A lot of people have read Thinking Fast and Slow, but not this book by Damasio. So he's a cognitive neuroscience scientist out of USC, and he was really interested in decision-making process and the mechanics of it and where it happens in the brain and how it happens. And he had this very unique opportunity where a colleague of him approached him and he said, hey, we've got this really interesting subject that we want you to interview. And he said, okay, well, why do you want me to interview him? And he said, well, here's his story. So he creates a fictitious name in the book. His name's Elliot, patient Elliot in the story. And Elliot was a very successful businessman, made lots of money, and then unfortunately started coming down with unusual headaches every morning, eventually got an MRI and has a tumor that needs to be removed from his brain. So he goes into surgery and has a large tumor removed from what's pictured here in this image, kind of this area behind the eye, this prefrontal cortex of the brain. And it turns out that he survives the surgery okay, and it seems like in the first couple months that everything's fine. So they present him with cognitive tests, math questions, judgment assessments, and he's able to articulate how to make all these decisions perfectly fine. He seems like, oh wow, this is a big successful surgery. But as the next couple months go by, everything in his life falls apart. He gets fired from his job, he has an affair, he gets divorced, and they're going, what's going on? Because this guy seems to be able to make appropriate judgments, but his life is falling apart. So they contact Dr. Damasio and say, can you kind of formulate what's wrong with this guy's decision-making process? And the observation Dr. Damasio made in talking to him is that he seemed totally paralyzed. He was like in analysis paralysis all the time. He could not make a decision, but he could articulate all the reasons behind wanting to make a decision as much as you want. You take him for lunch, he couldn't order a frickin' sandwich, but he could tell you all the reasons why he might want tuna, but then he decided he didn't want tuna because it wasn't, it wasn't dolphin safe. And he'd go into all these like diatribes about how he would make the decision, but he actually wouldn't make the decision. And then the other interesting observation Dr. Damasio made is he asked him to recount all of the bad decisions he had just made since his surgery and why his no longer had custody of his kids and his wife left him and he got fired. And he seemed remarkably unattached to telling the tale of all his follies. Like there was no sense of embarrassment or anything else like that. And so then he thought to himself, wow, this is really interesting. And he had this light bulb moment, and he's like, wow, I think I have found the man who can think, but he can't feel. And so then he had the bright idea of doing what? So what would happen if I subjected him to the Iowa gambling test? So what do you think happened with Elliot as he was presented with the same task? Nothing changed, so specify by what?
I think that his subconscious will just automatically go back and he will do the exact same pattern. That's my guess.
So how would it play out in the game?
He will go for the high risk at the start and he'll take a loss, and then he'll go back to the normal low risk cards. It's just a guess.
What does everybody else think? So if he doesn't have, for some reason it seems like he may have lost the capacity to feel or engage his emotions, perhaps that somatic sense, but he can explain what's happening. He might be able to recognize the pattern, but he's unable to make a decision or unable to feel something. What might happen?
Well, if he doesn't have a fear of loss, isn't he just going to take the higher risk over and over again?
Yeah, and so and what do you think actually would also happen to that somatic monitor, that galvanic stress response monitor, when it was put on his finger? Remember, over time, as the guys experienced losses, there were big spikes. What do you think happened with him? Flatliner. He was a total flatliner. And how did it play out in his behavior? He failed at the task every single time. He could never figure it out. But here's the interesting thing. At the end, when they asked him which deck of cards he should have picked from, he was right every time. He was able to explain which ones would have been, statistically speaking, where he would have actually won, and he would have been able to explain where the big losses were. But for some reason, in that moment, he actually wasn't able to make the decision to have the behavior change. It was really interesting. So it was as if he could tell you which door to open, but he couldn't actually reach out and open the door. So it's perhaps like this, like actually making decisions, okay? It's not just fast or slow, right? But it's also, it could be either, but they're never divorced from emotion in some way. That's actually part of the mechanics of making a decision. And I kind of want to get into a little bit of the so what about that as it relates to high stakes decision making. But I think this is the key first point of this talk, is just to introduce how important it is in our making of the decision. And to help illustrate this point a little bit more detail, I want to tell you the story of the first time I killed a patient. So in my training, as you obviously have to do, become an emergency physician, a lot of time in the trauma bay, working for the trauma surgical service. And as I'm sure you can be aware, and a lot of reasons I like this tribe and this complex decision making and this low frequency but high consequent environment, which is Avalanche sciences, there's a lot of similarities to my training as an emergency physician. in the face of this complexity, urgency, and chaos, we're asked to step back, right? Look at all and make a deliberate decision that's the safest pathway. But emotions can certainly get in the way. And on this night, we had a very busy trauma service. We had just taken care of a gunshot victim who was pretty critically unstable. And so my seniors, I'm just an intern at this time, my first year in, the senior surgeon and my attending had to rush off to stabilize this patient in the OR, and there was another accident on the way in that they wanted me to take charge of because this guy was going to die. And they told me as they rushed out and they left, they said, and don't call us unless someone's dying in front of you. Okay? And in that mind, I remembered being scolded a couple times before as I'm just learning the ropes here, right? And so I've gotten a little bit of operant conditioning. I don't want to experience that uncomfortable emotion again. So I get a reminder not to give them a call. And then we get another level 1 trauma comes in, and it was a cyclist in the middle of the night, a restaurant worker. It turns out lived just down the street from me, who was coming home at the end of his restaurant shift and was struck by a car at an intersection, knocked unconscious, and rushed into the hospital. And we did our dutiful thing and the full workup, a trauma assessment, ABCs, and thankfully had no immediate life threats. Airway was fine, no blood pressure issues. He actually came back to, no longer unconscious. But there was an interesting finding on his workup that kind of caught me by surprise. And he had, in this transverse foramen on the right, he had a fracture in his cervical spine. So it's not what we're trained as an unstable fracture that's going to paralyze you. But from my training and my anatomy, I understood that there's a small artery that runs through that transverse foramen. That's the reason why that hole is there. Your vertebral artery runs up through there. And I was kind of thinking to myself, like, gosh, maybe that's not good. I mean, there's this artery that's running through there. Maybe that's critical in some way. And I thought to myself, well, gosh, I think, and we haven't taken a picture of what the vessels running through there looks like, so maybe we need to do that. So I looked into the information real quick, and I kind of looked into the options, and there was definitely a low risk of a potential injury to that vessel. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, this guy's fine. He's alert. He's made it through it. It's now an hour in. I mean, what possibly bad could go wrong at this point? I'm getting the end of like a 30-hour shift. But I'm looking at the doors in front of me here, and I'm like, well, gosh, I guess the safest thing that seems to be clear to do is I should probably just image this guy. But I can't, at this phase in my career, I can't do that test without running it by my superiors. But I really don't want to call them and interrupt them, right, in the middle of that surgery. So in my mind, I don't want to deal with that uncomfortable situation, right? I've got a memory, I've got a feeling about it, what's going to happen. I have a feeling and a prediction what's going to happen when I call the operating room to do this test at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? So what do? Well, I think, well, okay, maybe those other doors aren't so bad. And like, okay, well, I can go to the neurosurgeon. I can consult the neurosurgeon who's probably not in the operating room right now, the chief neurosurgeon who would deal with the complication if we saw it, and mention, hey, well, what do you think, should I do this arteriogram to look at this vessel? And he said, oh, no, we never see that. We never see that at all. Don't even bother. And, I got to go. I don't have time for you. But this guy had expertise, and he's been in it for 4 or 5 years. And I'm like, okay. I've deferred to a superior, not necessarily my boss. I seem to have an answer that satiated me. So I went back to the patient. I said, hey, good news, you got knocked unconscious. You probably only had a concussion. There's no bleeding in your skull. You don't have any other major life threats. His wife was out of town. She was flying back after she'd heard about the accident. So I say, hey, just hang out here, board in the ER. It's almost 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm wrapping up, but your wife will be here in 4 or 5 hours, and everything will be fine. So of course, you know where I'm going with this story. I come back to work the next day, and I had one of my colleagues come up to me at the time, and I heard the words that you never want to hear as a physician, especially in the ER. Hey, you remember that patient you took care of the other day? Because usually you're about to get a zinger and some bad news. Well, it turns out he did get an arterial injury, pictured here as an example of that arrow. He dissected, totally clotted off that artery, and it doesn't cause immediate effects, but it causes a small stroke that just kind of insidiously causes damage over time, but in a small compressed compartment in the back of your brain, which slowly swelled overnight. Everybody thought he was just taking a nap, but he actually went into a coma, had to go into emergency surgery, never revived, and died within the next 12 hours. So what happened? So I had a feeling about something. I had all these little experiences, these little black clouds of experience from my prior experience of having to deal with that uncomfortable situation of advocating for what I thought was right, but I didn't want to deal with the backlash, kind of that bad emotional feeling that I had had previously in talking to these chief surgeons. And that caused a feeling at that moment of time prior to that decision, which caused a prediction about what would happen if I made that call, right? And so then I went to this decision and I picked that yellow door, okay, instead of the first one I identified. Now, obviously, what happens when we make a mistake and we learn the hard way, right? We get a new really big black cloud, right? And this thing, we never forget, right? This is our hard lesson. Right? This is the big black cloud that stays with us. This is the indelible mark on our memories that guides our feelings about similar situations as we carry on in the rest of our careers, right? And that created, obviously for me, a change in my approach to situations like this. And I unfortunately think this is a very common, this story resonated with so many of my junior residents when I became a senior, and that really helped with my mentorship my mentorship with them as I was teaching and training them, and their trust in me was sharing the story not only for the humility aspect and kind of the self-effacingness and the approachability, but also I just think everybody goes through this, because until you've had that big loss, what's the big deal? What's the big deal for you until you have a patient die in your hands as a physician? It's all those uncomfortable interactions with nurses and your superiors, right? You want to avoid those as much as possible until this happens, and then you realize all that shit ain't a big deal, right? I don't want this on my hands. So what's the spin? And to bring this back to this arena, is there something that we experience that 99 times out of 100 is extremely pleasurable, gives us positive feelings, and helps guide our decisions? Yeah, it kind of looks like this, right? Right? So that's where I think it gets really tricky with us, with our own decisions, and also as we're trying to coach other people when we're mentoring them as educators and or operating as a guide. And so here's another story. I, like many of you, had the pleasure of going to Japan a couple years ago. And it was great. It was everything that it was billed to be, right? Steady snow, good stability. It was just a steady diet of ice cream headaches and sake hangovers, right? It's exactly what you want when you go to Japan. But then, as many of you experienced snow practitioners know, one day something just changed, right? Okay, probably a combination of a little extra wind on one last system and a little more heat as it was getting later in the season. And what was going from dry loose was starting to look a little bit more cohesive. And I remember after this run, we actually paused and radioed to one another, and we actually had a kind of a collective check-in amongst our group. Like, hey, we're seeing a change. Do you see this change? Okay. So we kind of had, an informal change of the run list, right? So what was on our green, we adjusted what was in our green and started thinking about what's off limits, right? So I won't go into the details, but there clearly were certain aspects and at this elevation and angles that were now no-go. Literally no more than a minute later, as I'm the second going down, I stop and I look up, and one of my best friends and partners and about a father-to-be pauses on the top of a slope, looking down, enticing no doubt, but exactly the place we had just discussed not to go, commits and gets caught in a slab and carried down, and thankfully not completely buried. So afterwards, a little debrief. What were you thinking, man? Right? What were you thinking? And this is what he told me. He said, we're in Japan, man. It's just not happening now. That's what I was thinking, right? And he wasn't really thinking. He just said he was just wrapped up in the emotion of the day, and I let go of all my fear. He wasn't thinking. He was wrapped up in the emotion of the day. And again, back to this model I was talking about before, we just had in a short time frame a number of really positive experiences in very similar environment, right? And even though we did recognize that something had changed, that bias or that feeling about that environment and that place was certainly biased and tipped in one way, right? And that was a very powerful motivator in his decision making. But he too just had a black cloud, right? And and certainly based on that experience, it was a big learning lesson for him. And we kind of talked about this and in this paradigm. And I would argue that he will make that decision very differently in the future because of that, right? We all have close friends that have high-risk activities that they like to indulge in. And many of you know my good friend Gavin McClurg, who lives here. And we know what Gavin does as a paraglider and takes a lot of big risks. But one of his close friends that he flew with and did the Canadian Rockies Traverse with, so Will Gadd, I talked with Gavin a little bit about this talk, and he said, oh, and I was like, but I want to talk a little bit about tools to fix this, beyond just kind of the awareness. And he said, oh, well, Will's got this great thing. Have you ever heard Will Gadd's shtick about risk assessment and making decisions? Some of this might resonate with you guys or have heard this before. He calls it the positive power of negative thinking. And what is it, in essence? When Will is looking at making a decision, whether it be where he's taking off for launch or what route he's deciding to climb and what particular conditions that day on the ice, he not only looks at, he does the deliberate process, right? Risks and benefits of everything that's facing him. But beyond that, he goes to the next exercise. Instead of just saying, oh, yeah, I could fall and get hurt, he actually puts a black cloud thinking about every single thing bad that can go happen. But then on top of that, he thinks about how it would feel, how his wife would feel about it, how he would feel about it if he left his wife and kids making that decision and dying or getting, maimed or harmed in any way. And that kind of next level is what really helps him step back and makes it a regular exercise. It's almost like, I guess you could think, I haven't put it in the context of this, it's almost like an emotional checklist, right? Emotional check-in checklist. That's part of his checks. And that may be one way that we can combat against this. But, the alternative, I think, is how a lot of us have learned, either by personal experience or by proxy, is kind of the hard lesson, right? The hard lesson that I just told you about my own experience. But I think many of us have heard this from many of our friends, and I had a good conversation about this with McKenna, many of you guys know, and we talked a lot about after the loss of Chris, that many of you in this room were friends with Chris as well, and that impact on her career in those years ahead. And I think it does, to have that loss does no doubt make a profound change, but it resonates with us when we think about our own loss. And we had a really nice conversation on the phone, and I just asked McKenna, I'd love to just kind of hear your comments about this, and you mind if I record it, just to kind of share. She was organically going through this, and I thought it was kind of interesting to share. But this will play. Maybe. Or maybe not.
And intuition.
So she's talking about her decision-making process before.
Backcountry experience and Avalanche education. And I was pushing it a little bit every now and again. I had a higher risk tolerance, and sometimes it seemed worth it to me to push it just a little bit in order to find that feeling you get when you ski a fresh line, the joy and the contentment and the empowerment and finding your flow state.
It was a nice reflection on what Dawn had just kind of presented to us before about that edge.
To push it a little bit to get that feeling. And then 2 years ago, I had to call my father's longtime girlfriend and tell her that my dad had just died in an avalanche. And I watched my brother and my sister's hearts break as their lives fell apart, and my own life shattered. And we had to figure out how to keep going. And the trauma of my dad's accident is now my everyday reality. Every day. So my backcountry decision making is still based off of facts, past experiences, intuition, but I don't have any tolerance for risk. It's not worth it to me to push it even a little bit. It never was worth it. I just didn't know. I didn't know until I lived it.
I think this is a challenge, as a lot of us unfortunately learn this way, and we don't know until we lived it. But I think there's also something you said for well, perhaps that sympathy for those of us who have lived through this, but the empathy that you can feel with a story like that when you hear a voice cracking. It certainly is resonant for similar stories and experiences I've had in my life or family members that I've spoken to after loss. And so I think there's something, I guess I want to finish in the so what with this, is I think we really need to give a lot more value to the stories and sharing our feelings, and in the context of using that term. I don't think that's kind of we should discredit my feeling about something isn't quite right. I think there's actually really good evidence that it plays in a really important role in the decision. We should think about it as this person is actually trying to make a sound decision. So, for instance, you're out in a big adventure. If you might be less experienced with a really experienced partner, it's easy to get caught up in this vast expanse of opportunity and not want to rock the boat, right? Look back to my example of not wanting to be the person to create this little uncomfortable situation of being kind of the worrywart. But I'm not sure not sharing your concern, even if you're worried that you're not the most experienced one, is really a good way to go. If your feelings are telling you this isn't safe, because it probably warrants an opportunity for you to learn why perhaps it might be safe. But for the more experienced member and the partner there, I think that's an opportunity, right? This goes back to what Don was saying before. When you get that feedback from someone who's less experienced, and I know all of you guys have had this too, you do pause and listen, right? And you think. When your friend who's like a family friend or a good close friend, college friend of yours who has only been backcountry skiing 3 or 4 times, and you go out with them and they tell you that they feel really scared about what they're going to do, you want to push their envelope and you want them to have a good time, but you pause and you think about it a little bit more, and I guarantee you analyze the situation just an ounce more. And I think it gives you that moment to reflect, like Don said, is this a situation where I'm maybe trying to outfox the uncertainty here a little bit? So there may be some value there. I think the real challenge is for the educators out there, can you really teach this feel appropriately without that person having the consequence to know what that feel is? And that is actually a really loaded question, and I think that's the big elephant in the room, is I'm not sure. And I think a lot of times for those of us who work in medicine or in rescue, it's easy to really feel defeated that no matter how many times we preach this lesson over and over and over and over again, the accidents are still going to happen, and what's the point, right? I think I kind of called out back to Lynn on this, and it also brings Eric in, because Lynn tried to convince Eric to write about his loss, and he referenced his friend's loss before, and I think appropriately so, my initial reaction would be the same, that what is it to contribute to tell this story? And Eric kind of quoted Lynn back in her response, which I think was really on point, of the value of talking about these accidents, not because it's just another death on the pile, but it's perhaps another opportunity for someone to feel something that you felt. And Lynn said, per Eric's kind of synopsis, maybe you're struggling because these accidents that we and our friends are involved in don't always have data to refer to. They are visceral and painful and far-reaching, but the stories need to be told. And they need to be told even if they carry the same damn message over and over again, which is how a lot of these accidents seem year after year. Well said, Lynn, said Eric. And so I think as a community, I think we need to understand that there's value behind feeling and emotion. And if you've suffered a loss, I think it's potentially an angle to help someone else understand. And I'd like to have a community of friends, and I think I do, and my ski partners, when I have a loss or something goes south, when they come and ask me how I feel, it doesn't necessarily feel like a platitude, like a tap on the shoulder. I actually kind of sense that my friends are maybe trying to learn from me, and perhaps I'd like to feel like they're learning from my mistakes, not going through the same fate that perhaps I've had to. Anyway, thanks for your guys' patience and time, and honored to be here, and happy to tell you how I feel about my mistakes. Any other questions and thoughts? Yeah, Don.